the next 7 minutes to describe to you the traditional pressure safety valve known as a PSV. These valves may be referred to as a PRV, pressure relief device, or a PRV, pressure relief valve. These valves, for usage and their maintenance, are heavily regulated, as they're generally considered your last line of defense in an overpressure situation. On this sample PSV, you can see that the inlet and the outlet are threaded. The inlet and outlet may be threaded, it may be flanged, clamped, or even butt welded. Above the inlet is the body and the bonnet. On this valve, the body and the bonnet are one-piece construction. Typically on larger valves, the bonnet will be bolted to the body for ease of maintenance. The bonnet may be open or closed. If it's open, the spring will be exposed to the ambient conditions. Above the bonnet is the cap. Again, the cap may be open or closed. If the cap is open, you'll be able to see the alignment rod, the compression screw, and the compression nut. On the back of the valve, you'll see the lift lever. Not all PSVs have this lift lever, but if they do, they serve two purposes. One, if the valve is seeping a little bit, you can lift the lever and try to reseat the inner disc. Hopefully that will prevent the seepage. Two, you can test the functionality of the valve. By pulling on the lever, the internal spring will compress and the valve will pop, and you'll know that it's working. This gives no indication of set pressure though, it's only functionality. On the front of the valve, you'll see a nameplate. This essentially shows who made this valve and some important information on the characteristics of the valve. On the back of the valve, you'll see some screws. Not all valves have these screws. Some valves only have one. The important thing to realize is all the screws are wired shut and they have a clamp on them. This prevents tampering, and also the clamp indicates which valve shop worked on this valve. And if this wire is missing, the valve must be taken out of service and it must be maintained before it's put back into use. On the front of the valve, you may see a vent hole. It's important to realize on a traditional PSV, this vent hole must be sealed when it is in service. That's incredibly important. Again, on a traditional PSV, the vent hole must be plugged when the valve is in service. Now that I've explained to you the outside of the valve, I'll try to explain to you the inside of the valve and the inner mechanisms. I managed to get this image from the Flowstar Valve Shop off the internet, and it gives a good representation of the inner mechanisms of the valve. First, if you start at the cap, you'll have the alignment rod on the inside. The alignment rod must be straight and true in order to ensure that the valve functions the way it's set. Below that, you have the compression screw and the compression nut. Essentially, these serve to set the compression of the spring to make adjustments to the opening pressure. Below that, you have the spring, which is surrounded by the spring steps, which essentially hold the spring in place. As you move down, you have the guide, you have the disc, the blowdown ring, and then the inlet. On the disc, it is a circle, but it has a skirt around it, which is called the huddling chamber, which essentially serves to increase the surface area that the process would be exposed to. I'll explain this in a few minutes. As far as the rings, not all PSVs have rings, and some only have one. If it has one ring, it is called the blowdown ring. If there are two rings, you will have a guide ring, which is the blowdown ring, or a nozzle ring, which is the adjusting ring. If you have a blowdown ring, this will essentially change the dynamics of the valve, and you can use it to change the blowdown rate. If you thread the blowdown ring up, you will decrease the blowdown. If you have an adjusting ring, you'll be able to increase the blowdown, and you'll have a more distinct pop. Typically, the adjusting ring is not set by the valve shop, it's set by the manufacturer, and rarely is it adjusted. Now that I've explained to you the inner mechanisms of the valve, I'll draw you some pictures so you understand the forces involved. If you consider this your inlet, and this your disc, this area here would be the huddling chamber. So you have your process force, which is equal to the pressure times the area. The area will be this right here, and it is fixed until the valve unseats. On the top, you have your spring force, which is equal to your spring constant times the distance of compression. Once the valve unseats, so again, you have your inlet, your disc, your huddling chamber, you have your process force, and your spring force. The surface area that the process is exposed to is along here. And essentially, this will be your process in there. This essentially helps the valve to open instantaneously and smoothly. That doesn't mean it opens all the way to the max position. It just helps the valve to open properly, and it also helps it to blow down properly. There are a few considerations, however. Again, you consider this your inlet, this your disc. You have your process force and your spring force. If you have any back pressure on the discharge side, it is additive to your spring force. If you have back pressure, a traditional PSV is not the PSV to choose. You should use something like a balanced bellows PSV in order to mitigate any back pressure effects. There's one other consideration. Again, your inlet, your disc, pedaling chamber, process force, and your spring force. If you have a vacuum on your discharge side, this will essentially be additive to your process force, and your valve will open sooner than you expect. It is important that you make all these considerations when you're choosing your valve and sizing your valve. Now that I've discussed with you over the last 7 minutes how the valve works, how the forces work, I want to reiterate how important it is to realize these valves are heavily regulated and that you need to understand their mechanisms and how they work when you size your valve. These valves are traditionally considered your last line of defense in an overpressure situation. Thank you very much.